There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean Breeze Books. Welcome back to my channel and a very special discussion with the author of a very special work of literature that touched me so deeply that I can't stop thinking about it and talking about it. So now I get to talk about it and think aloud about it in conversation with the author. Karin Melberg Schwier, joining us from Saskatchewan, where I live, and Zoom is the best way to do this kind of thing, I think. So that's what we're doing. And her novel is called Small Reckonings, and it was published by Shadowpaw Press. This, I believe it's the second edition, is what I have. And it was 2023. I guess originally revised edition was 2021, and it was first published in 2020. And there's quite a story there, I think. Karin, welcome back.
Thank you. It's fun to see you again.
It's great to see you. Karin and I bump into each other at not only literary goings-on, but you're there and everywhere. And we won't embarrass ourselves by telling you all the places we've bumped into each other, but it's the first time I've seen her in any capacity since I finished her incredible novel, one of the strongest works of debut fiction I have ever read. As fine a work of Western Canadian, I would go so far as to say Canadian fiction that I've ever read.
I should mention that Shadowpaw Press in Regina is the publisher of the re-release in 2023, and it's also available as an EPUB.
Thank you. Good.
Yeah.
And it's available outside of Canada. You can get it from major online booksellers. And before I make her blush anymore, I'm going to let her talk. So, Karin, what's the opening premise of Small Reckonings?
It opens in a barn, a dimly lit barn.
It does.
And there's the local constable. This is in 1936 in rural Saskatchewan. The local constable arrives. He's been called to a farm and can't find the farmer, notices that there are milk cows bunched up out in the cold outside the barn when they should be inside being milked at this time of day. And he ventures out to the barn and sees a fairly horrific scene and is joined quickly by a distraught farmer's wife. And the mystery unfolds from there about why this happened to this farmer, there's no sign of struggle or other people to cause this event. And the story sort of unfolds from there as to why this tragedy happened.
Okay, very coy description of that opening chapter. That was very well done. You've talked about this novel a time or two before, and it was a very disturbing 2 or 3 pages. And then we jump to William, Toronto, March 1915. So as is my practice, this is going to be a spoiler-free chat at the beginning, and there's a lot of meat here that I am really eager to discuss with Karin. We're going to put up a spoiler wall when we get into the good stuff. Not the good stuff, maybe the bad stuff, but get into the details of the story. So anything after that is fair game. We'll certainly talk for 10 minutes or so at least before we put up that spoiler wall. But at that point, you will have to decide whether to keep watching if you don't care about spoilers, or rush out and get the book, read it, and come back, including the origin story, how Karin received it. We'll put that behind the spoiler wall as well. So Toronto, March 1915. Start at that point and give us a little bit more of how the story opens once we go back to the past.
Each of the chapters are written from the point of view of a particular character. So William is one of the main characters. He's an adventurer who left his home in New Zealand and came to Toronto, came to Canada looking for a better life. And in Toronto, he saw all sorts of romantic advertisements in the newspapers about this wonderful land out west with golden wheat fields and the land of plenty. All you had to do was come out here and give a few dollars and you could prove your own homestead. So he was interested in doing that. He wanted adventure that was away from where his father just cut limestone in New Zealand. And while he was in Toronto, he stayed at a boarding house and was quite intrigued by the niece of the couple who owned the boarding house. Very shy woman. He could see that there was something there. Got to know her. He left, went west on the train, couldn't stop thinking about her, so would write to her periodically while he's proving up this homestead that proved to be a little more difficult than the advertisements would lead you to believe. But when he finally got things sorted and thought that he might stand a chance of raising a family, he went back to Toronto to see if she might be interested in a new life out west with him.
William and Louise do get married. She does come out to the West, and she has a rather difficult time of it. Tell us more about their personalities, William and Louise.
Each of these characters, and probably all fiction writers do this, but there are bits of people I know that have been woven together to form these characters. And William, to me, was always a kind-hearted soul. The idea of having a family was really important to him. He was very generous in how he wanted to help Louise, how he wanted to help her settle into living life on a homestead in the West. Even though she was having some difficulty, Louise is a damaged person. The things that have happened to her in her life really have eaten away at her and continue to do, even though she's tried very hard to wrap that in a little black box and tuck it away and try not to think about it. She wants to live a happy life. She wants to trust that William will help her do that, but the little black box is still there. And so it's very difficult for her to relax and open up and welcome this new life.
And the layers and the nuances to her character, all of the characters, but her in particular, were just incredible. I can't stop thinking about her, and she makes decisions later in the book that we might talk about on the other side of the spoiler wall. But what a piece of work Louise was.
Mm. Mm.
We're not going to get into what the trauma was that she's hasn't really recovered from, but how did you make her character so nuanced? That's maybe not a fair question. How did you do it? But it would have been so easy to make a superficial character that was just damaged and that's all there was to her. And there was so much more to her. And so, how does that work? How do you build characters?
I can't remember if it was in a creative writing class I took or was just talking to other authors, but it's that whole idea that no character is either purely good or purely evil. And I think not that Louise was evil, but like you said, she can't be just damaged and that's it. There has to be things that are likable about her, that you feel some sympathy for her situation. And I think you do that by writing simple interactions with other characters, with her aunt and uncle in the boarding house, with how she managed at her job at Eaton's in Toronto, how she interacted with William, how she got over her fear about being with this man and leaving the home she knew. It takes a lot of rewriting. I think initially I made William too nice, too good. There had to be times when he would get impatient with her and almost angry that she was wrapped up in this thing that had happened to her, even though he didn't know what it was at that time. And I think it's just a lot of, as a writer, I think it was just a lot of trial and error in terms of what would I have done in a situation like that, or what sounds realistic as the interaction between the couple on different issues. And what's the resolution? They can't just fight and then nothing happens. You have to propel them forward to be in another place, doing something else, moving on from that, or if they don't move on from that, why aren't they moving on from that? So it's tricky, but I think most of what I write, I reread, and I often reread aloud to see if does that sound true? Does that sound possible?
You started off your answer by talking about this principle that no character is completely good or bad. And that, I think, is at the heart of what makes this novel so profound. And trying to figure out, I'm going to gesture towards it's early in the book, so it's not really a spoiler, but I'm going to still talk about it in an indirect way. But I want to probe this a bit. And I read this aloud to my mother, and she and I were both completely shocked at how William was on their wedding night in bed. Then I won't say any more details about it, but it took me a long time. And I think the last bit of it gelled for me as you were speaking, which is that these are characters that are, as much as they have autonomy and maybe a moral, certainly a narrative arc, they are also products of their time. And without explaining what he said to her, certainly that's one of the ways in which okay, there's more to William than first meets the eye, at least that night. And it didn't seem to, it was a little blip in terms of his character, and that he was basically a really good man. But I don't even know if I have a question here. See if you have anything to say about that.
He was a good man, but there are limits.
There are limits.
There are limits to my patience.
There are limits to his patience.
And if you think this was in the 20s, then there were certain societal roles that men and women played, or at least were supposed to play. And so when somebody doesn't meet those expectations, that has ramifications for the other character and how they react to that and deal with it.
And that shock mirrors another shock that's a reverse or almost a mirror image of that we'll talk about on the other side of the spoiler wall. And they have a family. So tell us about their kids. And I guess we're not going to say anything about what happens to the kids or how the story ends, but I've forgotten the boy's name.
John. There's so many things in this book that we can't talk about.
There is, it's a lusciously, literarily plotty novel indeed. Tell us about John and Violet.
John, I actually, and my brother is very tickled to hear this, but I based John's character on my brother quite a bit. And he was the first child born. I think he's 3 or 4 years older than the little girl who was born second. And he was almost like the saving grace for Louise, who felt that this could be her purpose, that all the trauma and bad stuff that had happened to her before, this was going to make it all right. She was going to be the mother. This was going to be her family. She could get past. She could put that little box and push it way down deep where she'd never have to deal with it again. So John was just the apple of her eye. And then Violet was born.
And that was a difficult birth and produced a lovely little girl with some big problems. Tell us more about Violet.
Violet was born in 1920. I'm just trying to get all my dates right here.
Something like that. Good enough, yeah.
She was born at home on the farm. A neighbor's wife, Hanusha Uzik, was the midwife. And Violet was born with Down syndrome at the time, so an intellectual disability. So at the time, she was called feeble-minded. That was the term that was used at the time. And actually, this kind of a story has happened decades since. But the doctor, once he realized that, it's one of those children, immediately told Louise and William that you can pretend that this one died. We will take it away and you won't have to worry about it. Your son won't have to live with this kind of person for his sister. You should pretend it died and try again and have another baby as soon as you can. And frankly, my husband's son, Jim is only 51 years old. And the doctor essentially said, we have places for children like Jim. That was 1974. So that has been a constant for many, many years. But it was the idea that this kind of a child would be too much of a burden for the family. The classic, this child will never walk, talk, or feed itself. That's still a term used. And it just absolutely devastated Louise and just dragged that little black box right back up to the surface again.
And we'll get get down in the weeds with that once a little later on the other side of the spoiler world. But she had worked with intellectually disabled children back in Orillia, Ontario. Tell us just a little bit about that without spoiling anything.
Orillia was a real institution for people with disabilities in Northern Ontario. And in my storyline, I had Louise working there. She left the boarding house and went up and worked there for quite a while. So she was used to people with disabilities. She was used to working with them. She had quite a progressive attitude and thought that people could learn, that they could learn to look after themselves. They could participate in activities and what was happening in the institution. I don't know in that era that people thought that they could live outside the institution, but that was where doctors sent them. So this wasn't a strange thing for her, but because of what happened to her there, Violet's birth clouded all that. These children have possibilities and potential, and just put her back in that time of tragedy for her.
I know that you worked for a long time in the field of disability, and tell us a little bit about that. And also, I think you must have done a lot of historical research. Tell us about that too.
I worked for an organization called, I won't use the name it was originally called, but the name was changed to the Saskatchewan Association for Community Living. And it's part of a federation across the country of advocacy organizations for people with intellectual and other disabilities, advocating for better services, better attitudes, better supports in the community, with the belief that people can thrive and contribute to their communities. I was the communications coordinator there for 27 years or something like that. A large part of my work was producing a magazine for the organization that went out to people across Canada and other countries, and featured a lot of stories about family experiences. So I interviewed a lot of young families. What's it like to first realize and understand that your baby has an intellectual disability? What does that mean? What's your life going to be like? But I found that maybe because of my interest in historical perspectives, I really was quite fascinated with interviewing older parents whose sons and daughters had been sent away to institutions. And what did that do to your family? What did that do to your relationship as a husband and wife? What did it do to the other kids in the family if you had them? What was it like to be told that you had to give your child up to this institution and you weren't even allowed to go see them for 6 months? That was really common practice because they said, oh no, you have to break that bond. You can't, if you come all the time and be with your son or daughter, then they won't ever get used to living here. And then even then, when visits were finally allowed, I've listened to awful stories about how a child was led out to stand in the waiting room in front of his parents, and they just stood there and looked at each other. And I remember one older parent, she was probably in her early 80s at the time, and she said, those were such traumatic visits. She said, I had to do them because I had to go see him. I just couldn't leave him in there and not see him. But she said, sometimes the visit would only last a half an hour. And sometimes her son in particular would have been drugged because they said that he was having behavior problems. Wouldn't you have behavior problems? Anyway, she said that every time she went, and when she left the institution, she would have her husband pull over into the ditch so she could throw up. She would just open the car door and throw up. She said, and that went on for years. So it was just those kinds of stories were what I wanted to weave into the narrative of this. And I think every example of situation or action or reaction is all from real stories that I gathered when I was working for SACL. Now it's called Inclusion Saskatchewan, but it's still the same kind of advocacy organization. But those stories just really struck me that there wasn't any support to keep your child at home. And actually, if people did, if they refused to send their son or daughter away, they would hide them. There are stories of neighbors who didn't even ever know that the child next door had a disability. They never saw them.
And I said a few minutes ago that William was very much a product for all his kindness and pleasant demeanor and basic goodness. He was a product of his era. And this is really crucial in his character that that something deep inside of him refused to let Violet go. And this is a pivotal moment in the way the story proceeds. And it's probably my last question on this side of the spoiler wall. Tell us more about that pivotal turn in the story that he refuses to let Violet be institutionalized and to keep her at home and also not to hide her away.
Yeah, I think had it been up to Louise,
Yeah.
because she just clung to the doctor's advice that we can make this problem disappear. I think she would have been even more ruined by it because of the guilt. But I think William just thought, no, this is our little girl, and we will not listen to the doctor. The doctor's a bastard. We're not going to follow his advice. And he was very forceful with Louise about that we're not talking about this anymore because she kept clinging to the possibility that we need to get rid of her. We need to send her away. She's better off somewhere else. And the more she pleaded with him, the more he just dug in his heels and no, and I'm the man of the household and this is the way it's going to be. And she's going to learn and we'll teach her. And she has John to help her. And that's just the way it's going to be. And I think at that point, something broke in Louise, broke even further, that here I am again.
And so that had catastrophic effect on her ability to be a good mother
To Violet.
to Violet. Yeah.
Yeah.
To Violet. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to put the spoiler wall up. And just before I do, I want to say that I'm going to give a trigger warning for this novel, which I hope will not prevent you from reading it, but also for the discussion that's going to take place behind this spoiler wall. And that is a trigger warning for sexual assault. So, with that being said, the spoiler wall is now up. Govern yourselves accordingly. As I just said, sexual assault is very much part of the story. And what you have done is so impressive, beyond impressive. I was just stunned by the sensitivity with which you didn't shy away from I think there's two, maybe three scenes of sexual assault without anything that was gratuitous, without anything that was unnecessarily explicit, but also not turning the reader away, not a gauzy narrative. How did you achieve that?
This isn't funny, but at early manuscript stage, my father-in-law, who was early 90s at the time, wanted to read the book. He'd given up on reading. He just wasn't interested in newspapers and books anymore. But my sister-in-law, Sue, said, just this is a lot about farm life. And he was from that era in Indiana on the farm, and you'd be interested in this. And so he started reading it and he kind of got hooked on it. And he'd read a few pages and she'd print off a few more for him. And then he got to the part where there was nasty stuff. And I remember being on the phone one time with him and he said, Karin, it's hard to read. He said, I know these things happen, but how do you know about them? And I said, Dad, I just make stuff up. And nothing has ever happened to me. But I've read enough. I've talked to other people who've had assaults happen in their lives to family members or to themselves. And it always struck me that the way I could write about them and make them more intimately horrific would be to describe the little tiny details of an event like that.
Absolutely.
Because wouldn't you just pull into yourself once the assault began? Wouldn't you just start noticing the crack in the plaster or the sound the buttons made when they were ripped off the dress and what they sounded like landing on the tile floor? Those kinds of things, I think, and maybe that's why those scenes affect people, is that it's just the details are so vivid, maybe. Anyway, I've read other descriptions of a sexual assault, and the ones that years later I can still conjure up that image or that sentence are the ones that described almost the insignificant details. Does that make any sense?
Sure, it absolutely does. And I'm grasping for a phrase, something like there's a kind of a visceral disassociation or a disassociative viscerality to that she is clinging to the details that are not about what's actually happening, but are tangible as a way of dissociating from what's
It's
happening like that.
sort of her brain wants to protect her mind from what's really happening. So let's look at this thing over here instead.
Just resonates so powerfully. So we don't have to spoil everything, and we probably are not going to talk about every little thing that isn't on the back of the book. But for people that are here, they don't care about spoilers. So we're talking about two generations of women that have been sexually assaulted. Louise endured a horrific trauma with a really bad guy at that institution up in northern Ontario, that the details of which the reader doesn't learn until her husband William does, when she leaves him and Violet to return to the east. And I don't, unless it comes up organically, that you can leave those details for the reader to discover. So then the weave that you've created it just tightens. She was involved in the care of an intellectually disabled young girl. How much do we want to give away? We don't have to give everything away. Let's see how I finish the sentence.
Okay.
And then she gives birth later, and that girl dies tragically in a way that she feels horrifically guilty about,
Yeah.
even though she was not herself directly responsible. But that is there's more to it, but that is a big part of it. And so then when she gives birth to an intellectually disabled daughter, all of that stuff comes back and more that we haven't named, and we still might, that just she is cast asunder in terms of
she's at a loss for
she's at a loss, and she's so in it again, and really until she leaves the pages of the novel, we don't know how she ends up particularly. And then she had been so worried, and she had good reason to be, both in terms of what she'd lived through and what she was worried about happening to her daughter, that intellectually disabled people often are very affectionate, and they're so vulnerable to sexual assault. And she was so worried about it, and it happened after she had abandoned her daughter, or after she had left her daughter. This is based on a true story. I don't want to put too much on the plate for you to respond to, but how did you weave all that together so tightly? Was all of that in the story that you received?
I think a lot of it was where I took it to flesh out that thread of the original incident that really happened. I wanted to explore, given that I was getting to know who Louise was, what happened to her, how she would react, how William would react, and the fact that it is true that the sexual assault, sexual exploitation, just the exploitation generally of people who are in vulnerable positions, living in an institution where the only people are the staff and the other residents. There's been just dozens and probably more than that of cases everywhere of people being sexually abused. And largely because the abusers say who would possibly believe them, or they can't even speak in such a way that anyone would understand or believe them. That's why today it's so important that people with intellectual and other disabilities receive a really good, solid education about their bodies, about social norms, about saying no, about being able to protect themselves. And if something does happen, I want to have the confidence that I can tell somebody, because the stories are rampant about people who've been told, if you say anything, I'm going to come back here and I'm going to hurt your mom, or it's just that kind of coercion that people have lived with for decades. And without beating people over the head with lessons about that in real life, I wanted to have a character who was very vulnerable, but maybe because of her father and some friends, neighbor friends, who started to develop the confidence where she could even stand up to her own mother. Before Louise left, she and Violet would have some arguments, and William always thought of that as good. Violet can speak up for herself. She's not going to just take it. And her brother was very good about that too, about helping Violet become more. When she wasn't allowed to go to school, he said he got mad. He said, "She's smart. She can learn things. I'm going to teach her stuff."
And he does. This novel is full of tragedy. It's so heartbreaking. Why did you do this to me, Karin?
I had one reader who called me halfway through the book and said, "I can't believe you killed that character. What is wrong with you?" This sounds like something goofy that a writer would say, but sometimes that's just what happened. That I would be writing about some stuff that was going on, and that's where it went. My husband said, there's going to be any people left in, in this book by the time you're done.
I can't believe this is talk about
Black humor. Yeah.
black humor. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it just about killed me when John was killed on his 16th birthday with the horse that is
Yeah. 13th birthday.
thirteenth.
They thought he was old enough to, or at least William thought he was old enough to have the responsibility of having a horse.
And the thing that's ineffable for me is that it's not just a tragic story. It's not a sensationally tragic story. It's threaded through with hope and love. So I guess it's just like life, depending on your
Mm.
perspective.
Yeah. Sometimes really awful things happen. And sometimes in some families, lots of awful things happen. And they either crumble or they still are for some reason positive about what's ahead.
Now, just while we're on the topic, one of many sad parts of the story, I got to get the laughter out of my voice, but this black humor is really getting me at the moment of John's death. That you tell us that through the perspective. The story is, what would you say? Maybe the terms are not helpful, but third person limited. Like we're in a character's, I
Point of
know
view. Yeah.
it's not it's always third person, yeah? But third
Right. Yeah.
person limited. So we first learn about John's death and we are in Violet's consciousness. And so she doesn't quite know what to make of it. So we're having to interpret what she's telling us and supplement it and so you're torturing the reader even more because Violet doesn't really quite get it. And so is this what's happening? And we have to get to the next chapter before we really it's confirmed.
Yeah.
So how did you
Why?
manage point of view? That's really quite something the way you did that.
I wanted Violet to be a reliable narrator, even though she has an intellectual disability. I wanted her to be able to observe things and try to figure out things. And I took myself back. I was raised on a farm, so I took myself back to what happens when the butcher came and butchered one of the cows, and what did that look like, and how does that work? Because I was just feeding him some hay yesterday, and now he's, oh, wait, what is death? What is that? And I wanted her to be able to really show that she was grappling with that and really trying to figure out and being scared and staying in the chicken coop while all this horror is happening after the horse accident. It gave me time to slow things down for her because everybody else was running around freaking out and outside when this happened. And you don't know what happened to John. And then finally, Hank is left at the farm because they can't find Violet. She's stayed hidden. And then when Hank obviously is distraught and comes out with did he come out with the rifle? Sometimes I can't remember if it's a scene I wrote and then I got rid of or if it's still in there.
I think you did.
Um,
Rifle. I think you did. Yeah.
yeah, because William was going to come back to shoot the horse.
We
Yeah,
get almost
so
a mirror image of that later when Violet is sexually assaulted and he has a similar reaction and interaction with Hank. Just thought of
mhm,
that now.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I wish I could say I did a lot of this stuff entirely on purpose, that I had it all mapped out and planned, and here's how this person was going to interact with this and how that storyline would weave. I don't know if this happens to other writers, but I think I just spent a lot of time telling myself the story. And I used to do this when I was a kid all the time. I would write stories when I was 4 and 5, and I would just scribble in a scribbler and talk about what happened when this duck lost his feathers and how he had to go collect them and tape them together. You're, if it's working well, your mind just tells you a story. And hopefully it makes sense and then you work on it and fix it but sometimes things just come out.
So tell us about how this story came to you.
I'm the editor of Saskatoon Home magazine, and I do a lot of writing for the magazine as well, and Prairie's North magazine. And sometimes I'll just hear something, or somebody will be talking about a thing, and I'll say, I got to write that now. It just lodges in here, and that's going to become a story no matter what. And I was working for SACL, the Association for Community Living, and an elderly farmer came in with a check. And he was the executor of his friend's will. And he said when this farmer friend had made him his executor, he was also to look after his daughter, who had an intellectual disability, who had Down syndrome. And when the daughter eventually died, the farmer was to dissolve the estate and give whatever remaining funds would be to an association like ours that advocated for people with disabilities. So that was fine. He came in and was talking to somebody up front. And I said, "Would you like a cup of coffee? I'd love to hear the story." He came in and literally took off his wheat pool cap or whatever it was, and wheat fell out. And I thought, I like this guy. And so he started to tell me this story about his friend, the farmer, who had this daughter with an intellectual disability. His name was William, her name was Violet.
Okay.
And he told the story about how he had agreed to be the neighbor friend, look after the family. The wife disappeared. And he said Violet was a very, very sweet, very trusting girl. And it's a shame what happened to her. And I said, "What happened to her?" And he said, another farmer had sexually assaulted her and she ended up pregnant. And of course, the baby at that time, baby was taken, big scandal in the community. And I said, "What happened to the guy who sexually assaulted her?" And he said, "Oh, he was pretty well banned from the community and banned by his wife, who wouldn't let him live in the house anymore, banished him to the barn where he spent the first winter and caught pneumonia and died." And I said, "Holy cow, that's a story." And I said, what happened to the baby?" And well, the baby was taken, and Violet, I guess, apparently came to Hank later in life and said, "I would like to see my baby one more time." And this was years later. The baby had been adopted. And Hank said, "Well, really? I don't know if that's such a great idea. Are you sure?" And I guess they found her son and they had a bit of a reunion. And I think the son went his way and Violet eventually passed away, but she wanted to see her boy one more time. And that's the crux of the true story that happened. And then I just embellished from there. After having gotten Hank's permission, by the way, he said, "I would like you to write the story." He said, I think that would be a nice thing. Nobody was alive anymore after Violet had died. Even her son, I think, had passed away. He said, "But if you could move it to a different place in the province, because it's something that still people remember it here." So I moved it to Watrous.
And so the Hank in this story is the man that you invited to, who
It's
took
the
off
real Hank.
his wheat pool hat.
Yeah.
Wow. And he is such a vividly drawn minor character. I'm hard pressed to call any of these characters minor. But certainly he would be one I'd say, is he really a minor character? I'm not sure. So, what was the process like of transmuting that? Because a lot of it resonates with what is in the story, and some obvious things are you have changed. But how difficult was it to fictionalize it, to make it its own thing?
Yeah, that was really hard in the beginning because I would think of something. I kept thinking about, I got to move the story forward. There's something, what that happened, but it's got to go somewhere. And I'd write something, but then I'd say, "Yeah, but that's not what really happened." And I had to keep reminding myself, that's why they call it fiction. You're making it up. You don't have to adhere strictly to those details. I think that it was based on a true story is what propelled me to write it. I thought that was a fascinating seed to start with. But again, I had to keep telling myself a story and is this plausible? Is this true? Is this interesting? What can I do to make this character more whole? And how is he going to be a whole character? And how is he going to react to another character that I have to make whole? It was hard to just get on with it and tell myself a story because I kept researching historical details. And you can waste a lot of time. And that was when I first started doing that. This was before the internet. I can't believe that it was that long ago that I first started playing with this. And I found a local history book from the Watrous area. Those local history books that people put together in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they were just so rich in detail. They were just such a wealth of information for any historical fiction writer. And so I just devoured that thing and used some of the real names of the stores and some of the families in the area and things like that. It's in a different, what really happened is in a different place, but still, just to get that taste of what farm life and rural farming community was like at that time.
So we've got this far into the conversation, and we haven't talked about, and I'm saying this in quotes, the villain of the piece, the perpetrator.
Mm.
And I'll get more into why I chose to put quotes around that in a bit. Tell us about Nick.
Nick's largely based on a girlfriend's dad who was a farmer,
I'm sure he was
Ukrainian.
happy to, your girlfriend was happy to hear that.
Ukrainian farmer, just rough around the edges, but I remember going to visit them one time and he just ruled the roost and yelled a lot and just was pretty difficult to be around. But as I was getting in my car to leave, he reached into his wife's dahlia patch and ripped off a bunch of blossoms and stuck them through the window and said, "Here, you take these with you." And I always remember that he was just this rough guy, but he wanted to give me some flowers to take home. He tore him out of his wife's dahlia bed, but so I had him visually in my head when I was creating Nick. And I wanted them to be a poorer farm family because at that time a lot of Ukrainian and Eastern European immigrants came to Homestead. It wasn't easy. They were because of their nationality, they weren't always really well accepted in the community. But he would come over and drink potato wine with William on the front porch, and they would help each other out. And I'll let your cows have that parcel of land, and then you can. It was just that kind of homesteading tradesies back and forth about just how to live life. So he was a rough guy, but he was decent until he wasn't.
And perhaps it was because I knew the true story that you based it on that I was nervous anytime he showed up and the way he would pay attention to Violet when she was much younger. And I can't remember how explicitly you depicted Louise's discomfort about Nick's handiness and flirtatious talk with this 6-year-old or however old she was, Violet at the
Mhm.
time. But it just
Little bells start going off, and you
little
think,
bells start going off, and every time he came into the room, so to speak, I was bracing for what was going to happen.
and you know what's interesting about that, I think, and somebody else said you wrote him to have groomed her for all this time to what led up to it. And I said, actually, I didn't. I was trying to show him as this rough guy with the dahlias who had a bunch of sons and whose wife didn't like him very much and who was this hardened farm wife with 6 boys. And he just liked the idea of a little girl, and not in that way, but he just got such a kick out of her and how cute she was, and that she would make him tea when he'd come and things like that. And so going into it, I never wrote him as creepy for all that time. He just liked her.
And nobody around, with the possible exception of Louise, before she left, was suspicious of the way that he was with Violet, and Violet adored him.
Oh, yeah, he said her hair looked like golden wheat. And she
Yeah,
liked to, when she was 14 or 15, she said she felt like she was a grown-up lady when he'd come.
yeah,
And Louise was suspicious largely because of her past, I think, what had happened to her. She was probably suspicious of anybody who would look twice at her daughter.
sure. Now, this is the part, this is what really deeply wowed me, and that is the way that you do a flashback after he rapes Violet and is discovered and arrested or charged and then commit suicide rather than to be arrested that day. Then we see the reactions of William and also Hank. You give us a flashback. Hank remembering when he was a boy and he was fishing and he got a fish hook in his eye or eyelid. And both Nick and William were very new to the community. So he went out carrying his fishing rod with the fish hook in his eyelid onto the road, and they come along together on their, what do you call that contraption?
The buggy, the
Buggy.
wagon. Yep.
And they come to his aid, and you give us a long description, and we know what Nick has done. And then you take us through this story where Nick is at his very best and makes such a deep impression on this kid, Hank. And that
Well,
was
there's
gut-wrenching because in a way that I've never experienced before in a book, you just imprint the layers of that, like the people in a small community, a tightly knit community, what it means to come to terms with somebody perpetrating such an act of evil. It's somebody that they've known before that in more that he wasn't a bad guy, and then something really evil. And oh, that just about killed me. And you're way up on a pedestal because of what you did there. I don't know if I have a question, but I just needed to say that to your face.
wow. I'll have to read that part again to see what I did. And the fish hook was real. The fish hook was in my eye when my brother took me fishing at a little creek, and he was pretending to cast, and he thought he'd got it hooked in the branches behind. I was standing right behind him, of all places, and I think I was about 6. And so we had to walk home with me holding onto the fish hook. And the entire way home, he kept saying, "Don't tell mom. Just don't tell mom. Don't tell mom." And so I think we had to just get snips and cut the end off so you could pull it back out again.
You describe all that in gory detail. That was incredibly fascinating. Is the title ironic? Small Reckonings? Really? Small?
I think there's so many small decisions or choices that people made, different characters made throughout the novel that would just send their lives in off in good or turbulent or awful directions. And every one of those choices had a consequence. So I guess the collection of the small reckonings turns out to be a big one in the end.
Tell us about the sequel and even how that was handed to you to do with what you would.
Well, when the original edition of Small Reckonings was published by Burton House Books in Regina, and Berna Barclay, who was a really well-known writer in Saskatchewan, was my editor and published that book. And when I first gave her the manuscript, it was one of those things like this, and she pulled it apart and she said, "This is going to be your first book. This will be your second. So put that aside." And she pulled out probably a third of the book, and we just put it away. I put it in my safe in case the house burned down. And so we just worked on the first novel, and it doesn't end where I originally had intended it to end. And I sat on this stack of 100 some pages, and I knew something had to happen with it, but I wasn't sure what. But it had to be written. It was one of those I have to write this things. I think it was in 2021, Hank, the real Hank, came back for a visit. Came for coffee. We did a distance coffee on the porch. And I said, "Hank, you told me that story a couple of times, and I never recorded it. Would you tell it again?" And he was a real storyteller. So, that was nothing for him just to, "Oh, yeah, I remember that story," and tell it all over again. And he was about 10 minutes into the story. And I said, "Wait, you never told me that before. What are you talking about?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, no, that's what we think happened." And I said, "Hank, the first novel wouldn't have been written the way it was had I known that was what you really thought happened." He said, "Oh, yeah, sure." And then added some detail and then finished telling me the rest of the story as I remembered it. And after he left, I said to my husband, "This is what Hank just told me." And he said, "There's your sequel." It's one of these what things. And it was during COVID. I sat in the guest room and Rick said, "Disappear, go in there. I'll bring you meals. Just do it." And I didn't do it in a week, but it took me probably of 3 days at a time, every other week or so. I finished it. I think that was March, and I finished it in September. And it was weird because I wrote it and it just went click with those last pages that I had set aside from the first novel. So it was almost like these two pieces just went doink. And of course, I did a lot of editing and fixing. My husband read it, and he's probably my best editor because if something's not working, he'll tell me. And if it's working, he'll tell me. So, anyway, that's the sequel. And I've had so many people, book clubs who read the first novel, who have emailed me and said, what happened to Louise? What happened to Violet then? What? So, the sequel kind of tells you.
And I think, are you not a two-time winner of the John V. Hicks Long Manuscript Award for both this one and the
Mhm.
sequel?
Yeah, I was pretty lucky. When it was in manuscript form for the first, I got it. That was in 2019,
19, it says here.
19. Yeah, and the sequel manuscript won it in
22.
2022.
And I am not sure that I have a whole bunch of publisher people watching, but any of them that are, I hope will get a hold of me and I'll put them in touch with you, because this sequel, this already award-winning sequel called Inheriting Violet, right,
Yep.
is ready to be.
It would make a lot of book clubs really happy to get it because I still get what's happening with it. Have you found a publisher yet? We've got it on our list. I'm trying.
I will do what I can. I don't have too much influence in the real world, the publishing world, but maybe this much, and I'm going to do everything I can. And I hope you'll give me a chance to read an arc and interview you for that interview to go up on your pub date.
Yes, from your lips.
I'm very grateful for all the things you put me through and made me reckon with, big or small, with this novel, Karin.
Well,
Thanks.
I hope I didn't make your mom cry.
I don't know. I think if you did, she'd probably want to thank you for it.
That's the nicest thing anybody said to me today.
Thanks so much, Karin.
Thank you.